in the house. Yo. Everybody's looking. Inflation, bad enough is blowing my concentration to continue my fight for education so I can maintain a decent occupation and not a drug operation. So me and my homie joined the service, the army, to make dollars, be all that we could be, do some traveling, and see the world for free. What suckers were we? A year and a half has passed of being yelled at, cussed at, and getting gassed. They got me by the collar. Is this what I signed up for? To make dollars? And to make matters worse, they took me to the desert. My homie came back in a hearse. Stopped the naked aggression, but the killing machine, as always it seems, has had its succession of jokers, misfits, has-beens, and such. But to the man, it don't matter too much. Getting caught like a fish on a hook, you've been took. Yeah, you've been took. What's up, Alex? A militant brother with a mind, the one of a kind, the class the mass of brass studs find to be dangerous. In today's society, they put us in combats, kill us all for free. Now, if I shot a man today, guaranteed life in the can, take me away. So where does it justify a man with a gun and a salary becoming the part of a shooting gallery? Common sense you achieve can be lost, not to mention your life at your own cost. Just like in chess, they grab your last rook, you've been took. You've been took. Let me hear y'all say, you've been took. You've been took. Come on, loud, come on. You've been took. You've been took. And now the battle is done, but the war goes on. Keep up the fight before you're gone. And what about all the casualties? You think the man will give a damn about you and me? You're a fool if you think so. Remember the last show? Just say no. Yeah, we know we ruffled some feathers there, but now we're back again with a new word, my friend. Don't get taken or your words will be shaken, and whatever you hold true, it'll be fake and phony. Just like the lies that they told me. The life in the army was the one and only. I guess I had stupid on my face, and the Judas goat got me. But that ain't the case today. The wool is off my eyes, and now I realize they was nothing but lies. In the real, they copped an attitude, but then they had to cool it. Because there were some crazy brothers out there who had a bullet or two, and the brass knew it, so they put on a mask to ask for the task, to pat me on the back. But who asked you to substitute for my friend killed in wartime? His chance for life is gone, but I'm getting mine. And as the anger explodes out my head, besides his graveside, just to see him dead. You were never there to see his life end. You give his family money they can't even spend. The grief, the pain, and the suffering. Your birthday money couldn't begin to do the loving for the feelings of the girl, the feelings of the kid. You ain't even aware of the pain that you did. And while this girl is waving her hair, you're worrying about a sucker and getting another one out there. But this one will be a little smarter and play a little harder to get. And when the goat get the contract, keep in mind he don't care about you, just his behind. So when you raise your right hand, give him a look, the finger, and then book before you get took. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Emily Pye. And I think we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good program for you. And we have a very good pro Maybe I can say on behalf of all of us a big thank you for having invited us to take part in this panel, this discussion about war, something that has a lot to do with my family. And my grandfather founded this museum after he himself was a conscientious objector and didn't want to go into World War I. And that was not allowed in that time under the German emperor. So he was put to prison. Now the film, which has a length of about 10 minutes. Okay. Well, I'm actually finished now. I just wanted to say the film has a length of 10 minutes, and so I don't have to explain too much. The film will explain you everything. Thank you very much.
Recently, I was stumbling through the weedy fields and heaps of stones that used to be the old Berlin of my youth. I was looking for 3 or 4 small rooms on the ground floor, which you could enter by an ordinary shop entrance. In these rooms, not far from Parochial Church, a man had lived whose work had influenced my life decisively. His name was Ernst Friedrich, and in that modest shop he had built up a permanent exhibition, which he called, somewhat exaggeratedly, the Anti-War Museum. But the place where the Anti-War Museum had once stood was not to be found in the ruins of old Berlin. This was written a little sadly by Robert Jung, 1966, 1 year before Ernst Friedrich died. Today, on the site of the former Anti-War Museum in the long-lost city center of Berlin, he would only find this memorial plaque to the original museum. Today's Anti-War Museum is situated in Brüsseler Street 21 in the former borough of Wedding, which now belongs to the borough of Berlin-Mitte. But first of all, let's take a look back in time. The beginning of the First World War. The enthusiasm for war seems curious to us today, as well as the ignorance of the German people who were told that war would be just like taking a Sunday walk. When Ernst Friedrich objected to going to war, he was first put into a lunatic asylum and then sent to prison.
Right, so thank you very much for the invitation. Now, I won't sing anything, but I'm very happy to be here because I believe it's very important to speak about the First World War, not only because it's anniversary and it's popular, but it's also consequences for basically the whole world, and it has until now, because just for example the new states which were created after the First World War, they most of them with some pauses after the Second World War, they actually exist until now. Then there was, for example, the Russian October Revolution, which did not end in 1989 or 1991, but it lasts until now when we consider the regimes in Cuba, for example, or North Korea. So it had great impact. But it's also important for Poland. I was asked to show the Polish perspective, but I guess it's just an example of a broader perspective, that is the Central East European perspective. Now, yesterday you watched, or some of you watched, the film based on the book by Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front. That's a great book, a good film, but it doesn't show the whole First World War. It shows the Western Front. In the Eastern Front, and including Poland, was slightly different. So having this in mind, let's proceed to Poland. And now a very short history of Poland until 1914. Now, due to a number of reasons, Poland, which was one of the most important countries of that region in early modern times, and probably one of the biggest and most important in Europe at that time, from the mid-17th century was undergoing different crises. It suffered from a number of wars. And then in the 18th century, in 3 stages, in 1772, then 1793 and 95, it was partitioned between Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and it basically disappeared from map. I mean, there were some changes over the 19th century, but let's not get into details. Basically, it wasn't an independent country. There were a number of uprisings, mainly against Russia, but they all failed. And Poles understood that in order to regain their independence, they should wait for a moment when all these 3 countries, which divided Poland, would start fighting against each other. And that happened only in 1914, so around over 120 years after the last division of Poland. So that's very important, actually, because the whole geopolitical system situation changed in that year. Very early in August 1914, some Polish leaders, politicians started creating Polish military units. Among them, one of the most important was Józef Piłsudski, a socialist. And the situation changed pretty fast, and it was changing pretty fast in Poland because the first Russian offensive, sorry, I don't have a map. The first Russian offensive in northern, let's say today's Poland, so in East Prussia, was stopped by the Germans in in autumn 1914. That was this famous Battle of Tannenberg, which is still remembered in Germany. That became kind of symbol. Then the second Russian offensive in southern Poland, in Galicia, was stopped. At first it was very successful, but then it was stopped in around mid-1915. Also Polish troops were fighting there. I'll just take some water. And from mid-1915, actually, there was no front in Poland because the front moved eastwards. So Poland was then only under the German and Austrian occupation. What is important, although there were no fights from that time on the Polish, main Polish territories, there was the occupation, which meant looting, deportations. Hundreds, thousands of Poles were had to serve forced labor. There was hunger, not enough food. They had to give food ratios for the German or Austrian military. So a number of people died just because of hunger, for example, or illnesses. But still, Polish military was growing, and there were 2 ideas. One was to serve on the side of the Central Powers, so Germany and Austria-Hungary. That was Józef Piłsudski, as I said, and the other was to support Russia. Not both. All 3 countries actually tried to encourage Poles by saying that there could be some kind of Polish state after the First World War. It could be in union with Russia. It could be some kind of separate state created from the Russian territories. But these countries didn't want to reopen the Polish question, so to say, and that was a general attitude of the Western countries before the war and during the war, because the Entente countries, they believed it is simply an internal Russian question, and they didn't want to irritate their ally. And there was no one, in fact, cared about Poland. However, when the Polish, when the war was going on, all the states were in desperate need of soldiers. So they really wanted to have Polish soldiers. So in November 1916, Germany and Austria created something, or they tried to create something, which was called the Kingdom of Poland. There was no king. They created a regency council, which should then probably elect a king. There were no boundaries really mentioned, but there was free education. Polish was used at the university. You could teach in Polish, so there were some changes. They wanted to have Polish troops as a kind of reward. And then the next step was in 1917. The Central Powers wanted the Polish troops to swear oath to them, to the Kaiser. But that was already a moment in which Polish leaders understood that actually if they swear oath to these countries, they will end up on the side of the losers. So there's no point in doing that. So they didn't agree. Therefore, many of them were imprisoned. The leader Piłsudski, lots of officers, soldiers. But nevertheless, in the First World War, there were hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers serving in the three armies, in fact, shooting at each other. So that was a really traumatic situation. For example, in 1916, there were almost 2 million Polish troops serving in these three armies. And then, I don't know how much time I have, but probably not very much. So getting to the end of the war, on November 11th, 1918, there was an armistice called on the Western Front, and that was also the moment when Józef Piłsudski, one of these Polish leaders, came back from imprisonment in Magdeburg to Warsaw, and he was called Chief of State. And then he started integrating different centers of power which were being created in Poland in different territories. So from that moment, the new Polish state was started to be created. So although in the Western countries, the First World War is remembered as slaughter and a very tragic moment, in Poland, on the other hand, although we had extreme high losses, maybe not that high as in Germany, but still around 900,000 soldiers were wounded, almost 500,000 were killed, which consisted of around 3% of the Polish population, less than 3% of Polish population. So it was almost European average, but the result was that actually Poland gained independence. So that was much more important, and that's what is still remembered. It wasn't, however, the end of First World War for us, because then there were a number of wars going on the Polish borders until 1921 against Soviet Russia, against Ukraine, Lithuania, and so on. Also, there were a number of uprisings against Germany to gain Silesia and Western Poland. So Poles had to fight their way in order to gain their state. So although in the West war lasted from 1914 until 1918, you can actually say that in Poland and broader in Eastern Europe, it lasted even from 1912, that is when the Balkan wars started, until well, around 1921, when most of the states were created. So it was much longer. Now the memory of the war in Poland, it differed in the time. Shortly after the First World War, there were two dominant issues in the memory. One, these were sufferings, hunger, deportations, and so on. The other was bravery of the leaders, and it was actually very important who served in the military in the Polish military. A number of officers became later on Polish politicians. Then during the Second World War, of course, no one remembered any longer the first one, the First World War. And soon the Second World War overshadowed the first, which was originally called the Great War. Then during the 1950s, under a communist regime in Poland, we couldn't commemorate the First World War and the successes, because that would lead to the Polish-Soviet War and to remembering of this war, which was lost by this Red Army and which was not well politically well seen. Then from 1960s, the Polish historians were allowed to speak more freely, and they started talking about the fact that actually we indeed gained independence in 1918. Now, although today it's not maybe so much remembered as in Germany or in France or in Belgium, but each year on 11th of November we celebrate the Independence Day. So the end of the First World War is our Independence Day, which is extremely important. But since the Second World War was far more dramatic, and there was, for example, the Warsaw Uprising, which started at the 1st of August 1944, we rather tend to remember these events than the First World War, but therefore it's important to speak about it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the kind introduction, and I have to tell you, I will talk about the First World War. So I'm not just talking about the war and arts in general, but much more about how the First World War is seen through the eyes of German artists back then, during the time of the Great War, as well as today. This first picture you can already see part of a detail of an image by Willy Jäckel, as we'll now continue our short travel through war in the arts. When most people think of war in the arts in the First World War, when it comes to the German side, usually they remember works by Käthe Kollwitz, by Otto Dix, by George Grosz. And the issue is that most of these works, as you can see, Sturmtruppe geht unter Gasforce, the Stormtroopers advance under gas, it has been made after the war, sort of a remembrance of usually the soldiers having been taken part in the work by themselves, and they made impressive works in the 1920s. Having said that, what is usually forgotten is what kind of art has been produced during the wartime by itself. And what we can first state is that Impressionism completely failed to depict the horrors of the war that was about to come. So throughout the late stages of the 19th century, Impressionism was the most cherished art form, but when it came to the Great War, it was nearly impossible to show the utter destruction. So Theodor Rocholl was one of the most famous painters of war scenes and of nobility, etc. But when he made his pictures as beautiful as they still are, and interesting from the art historian kind of perspective, they cannot really depict the utter chaos, the utter destruction which has been experienced by the soldiers and by the civilians back then. Contrary to Expressionism, which was able to depict, well, in 2 words, to express the feelings, to express the chaos, to express the utter destructions, these levels of destruction experienced by the soldiers. And what we can see is a picture by Otto Fischer-Trachau. He made it in 1916. There's so many other works being made, and it's a surprise attack with hand grenades. You can actually nearly feel the hand grenades exploding. Of course, there were other approaches as well. So, especially in the first stages of the war, 1914, 1915, there were lots of heroic kinds of artworks. Olaf Gulbrandsen made this Deutsche Wacht in Kiaochu just before the German colony of Qingdao fell to the Japanese and the British, and it's actually quite a racist kind of connotation. So you can see this Hokusai style wave of the Asian attackers, and the wife have some sort of ape kind of Asian faces. And it's quite interesting that Olaf Gulbrandsen, he worked for the Simplicissimus, and this was one of the most scathing satirical papers. He did lots of caricatures versus the Kaiser, versus the nobility, but after 1914, after the outbreak of war, they were only focusing on doing this heroic kind of stuff to support the government, to support the war. Of course, there was also propaganda art on a very sudden level when it comes to Germany, mainly focusing on getting war bonds. So there's quite famous examples from Fritz Erler on the left side, Helft uns Siegen, support our victory, and on the right, Hans-Rudi Erd, both from 1917, U-Boote heraus, so take out the submarines, support our troops. These usual kind of heroic soldiers, whatever they do. And having said that, that didn't really work. Not in 1917, not in 1918, not even in 1916. So this worked until 1914-15, but then so many troops came back on leave, came back wounded, or did not come back at all as they had already been killed. So people didn't buy any longer that it's really working that way. Art, on the other hand, especially after 1915, after the first hopes of our quick victory were completely gone, worked on a very different kind of levels. Max Brüning, he made lots of portraits, and before that, usually portraits of soldiers were portraits of leaders, of generals, of emperors. But in the First World War, it started that normal soldiers were portrayed. And Max Brüning, in his Nordfrankreich Sommschlacht, englischer Soldat, which is northern of France, some battle, English soldier from 1916, he portrayed an English prisoner of war. But you actually can't see that he's a prisoner. You can't see that it's a derogative kind of painting. It's just a person, and only today's experts, sort of experts, can see, well, this is actually not the German helmet or the French helmet, but the British kind of helmet. Could see, well, if he's a German artist, if he's working in France, if this is a German soldier, this is a British soldier, obviously, it must be a prisoner. But it's not a point. It's much more about individual suffering. It's much about portraits of normal, of everyday people, not any longer just of leaders, of generals, and of heroism. Another example, actually not by a German, but an Austrian artist, Albin Eckerlin's Die Namenlosen, 1914, so the nameless, 1914. He made it in 1916, and it has been depicted also as heroic kind of painting, but I can't see it that way. As you see, these soldiers, they do not march in a military kind of style, but they're burdened, and they are almost walking to a battlefield as to a slaughterhouse. And only the central figure can be seen as an individual, so all the rest is just a mass of soldiers who are actually up to get killed. Willibald Krein, he made a very impressive and powerful series, a map called Krieg, War, back in 1916, and it's fantastic pictures. The left one is called Gebet Sieg, so prayer for war, and the right one is called Sieg, the victory. So when you can see on the lower side the people praying for war in front of the crucifix, they think they can pray for victory for their God, but above the clouds it's just Satan who triumphs. And the victory on the right side, it's just a blood-drenched dagger. So there's no heroism in this kind of victory. There's no relief in this kind of victory. Victory means utter destruction. This is already back in 1916. Otto Schubert, 1917. He made a series, The Horses Suffering in War, and his drawings focus on the animals suffering. And this drawing called Angst, Fear, is one of a very impressive kind of map on a perspective which has usually been forgotten, that millions of horses had been used and millions of horses had been killed, together with other animals as well. And I come to Peter Eichmeier. He's a contemporary artist. He did a graphic novel approach to All Quiet on the Western Front. So it just was published well, actually not in 2013. He made a picture in 2013. The graphic novel was published just a few weeks ago. And it's sort of a Reader's Digest version of All Quiet on the Western Front, together with his Impressionist style kind of paintings. What you can't see, most probably from the distance, is that in this eye, fearfully opened by the soldiers, there's a German soldier stabbing his French counterpart with a bayonet, and it's just mirroring in this eye. And it's a very interesting kind of approach to have these kind of graphic novels. And there's quite a few ones mostly from the French, from the Belgian side, but there's also new Swiss, German graphic novels coming on, addressing the First World War in a very different kind of way. We now come to contemporary war, and contemporary art, so to say, and which is very interesting when it comes to the First World War, that nearly all the artists took part in the war back then. So Otto Dix, for example, which you can see in this picture, it's not really sure if it's been dated in late 16 or early 1917. He went there through the whole war. He survived it. He won the Iron Cross, second class, as some other artists as well. Other artists went there for a year, were killed, like Franz Marc, like others, came back wounded. So it's very different kind of experience to artists today, which got their war experience from the media and from popular culture. I don't say that it's necessary to be a soldier, I don't say it is necessary to fight in war, but I just want to say the experience was quite different. Chris Dreyer, a female artist, using pinhole photography on the former battlefields of the Western Front. Her series is called Souvenirs de Verdun. She works on this since 2006, and it's old armory, old tracks from trains, and it's still, she said to me, it's still an area which is now overgrown by hedges, by green. It looks like it looks rather peaceful, but she says whenever she's there, it's not peaceful at all. You can feel it. And I continue to Robert Schneider. I just met him in his Hamburg-based studio again, and more than 10 years ago, 2001, he made a 42 works cycle called Verdun. This is now Verdun number 34. And this is actually not a photography, this is a charcoal drawing. And he went there together with his wife, who's doing photos, he makes sketches, and his style is always a very, very photorealistic kind of style of works, and usually addresses subjects like terror, war, our history. So he had a huge cycle on Auschwitz, he had this huge cycle on the Bremen bunker where so many forced laborers died, as well as the Battle of Verdun. And he depicts not reality, but he depicts, so to say, the emotions. So the scenes he depicts and he draws or he paints, they look like photos, but they are not photos at all. They are not just a painting of the reality, but you can feel in his series, they're actually quite huge, 1.50 meters by 1 meter, how much blood has been flown into these areas and these battlefields. Coming to a complete different kind of approach, Asmus Petersen, he's now in his early 80s by now, and since the 1970s he made huge series of rather abstract paintings. So when you just see these kinds of arrows and lines, you could say, well, it's some kind of arrows and some kind of lines. Actually, this is the movements of usually naval contingents. Here's the Battle of Jutland at a time between 5:20 p.m. and 5:48 p.m. A very, very famous kind of sea battle, more or less the one big sea battle of the First World War. And he uses very, very high level of abstraction to approach a war which cost so many lives. As he says, well, I can't depict that, I can't depict suffering, it's not impossible, but it was movements of people. Coming to Alexander Seiler, he's living in Nuremberg, and he made a series of huge battleships, so they're actually between 5 and 8 meters long, weighed between 700 kilos and a ton. And this is called Pantersprung, as there was some kind of gunboat diplomacy action in 1911, where the German Kaiser sent the Panther, a small kind of gunboat, to the Mediterranean to make their stand. And it looked differently. There's a similarity, of course, as well as with the other ships Alexander Seiler does. But it's also about the cultural downfall of the world. So these ships, they don't look grand, they don't look powerful, they're crumbling. And the closer you get, you can see tiles coming off the parts of this architecture. So we call these works Archiskulpturen, so a mixture of architectures and sculptures. And there's lots of remnants to classic sculptures, to classic architecture. And these columns, these tiles, they all fall off, they're crumbling. So these old war machines, and they are intended to be powerful, they're intended to solve a heroic purpose, but they're just crumbling. And as humble as I am, there's only a known work by myself actually on show in Berlin. It's a series of ready-made art. So this is actually very abstract, but this is a sonar image of the Lusitania. And I don't know how much you know about Lusitania. It was a passenger liner, British passenger liner, sunk by a German submarine in 1915. But within this issue, you can see so much of ambivalence regarding this First World War. As the sinking of the Lusitania was a huge propaganda issue in Germany, as it was such a huge ship. And it was a huge propaganda issue for the Allies, for the Entente powers. As it was a passenger liner, and 127 Americans lost their lives when it was being sunk. And until today, it's a very kind of contested issue. It just was for a few weeks in the UK, and nearly all the exhibitions I saw about the First World War had Edith Cavell in it and the Lusitania in it. And only one of it tried to do sort of a full picture story. As usually most of them said, well, the Germans always claimed that it had weapons on board, full stop. And back then, actually, both the British and the American government said, no, this is just a passenger liner. But there was a diving expedition in 1993, and it clearly found out that actually the German claims were true, that it carried more than 4 million rounds for rifle ammunition and several thousands of explosive shells and shell cases. So, very difficult to have a passenger liner and pack it full of ammunition and then see what happens. So it's a very contested kind of issue, and this is, well, the sonar image of the Lusitania, which lies off the coast of Ireland, and I have also some submarines, some other ships in this series. So there's naval institutes provide me with three-dimensional sonar data, and I use different angles to show what I would like to show. I'll now leave the First World War a little bit and come to more contemporary wars, and by doing so I get to the Second World War. Jens Kloppmann, who always works with political issues in his artworks, has a whole series which is called Bullets. And, well, it's actually holes, but it's not just holes. He went to Berlin in 1992, 1993, and he was amazed how many bullet holes are still visible in the city, or back then at least there were, 10 years ago, plus 20 years ago. And so he started to take off these bullets from the walls by plaster. And even more so, you can't see if it was a villa, if it was a factory, if it was a shabby building. So because it's white, it's very simple, it's simplified, so you just see the bullets, the bullet holes.
Thank you so much for having me here. Talking about museums, which have an aura of being extremely boring. Who feels that? Museums. What do you expect to see in museums? Apart from history museums, maybe contemporary art museums? Paintings, yes. Yeah, then when we're talking art again, history. And how is this history mostly depicted? Artifacts, yes. in cases, and how do those cases appeal to you? Not much, right? That's sort of the burden of my everyday work, is how to get museums relevant. How to get museums relevant for an audience like you, like younger people that go to the Biennale, go to the Hamburger Bahnhof, but also go to cultural history museums. And I'm now representing this cultural history museum, or even worse, a cultural ethnological museum, which is on the scale of being an important museum somewhere down below. Well, below us come the natural history museums and so forth, although they're very interesting, actually, by the way. I'm the acting director of this Museum of European Cultures, and we are in Dahlem, and we collect, research, and show everyday life. Very strongly still, because we have this old German collection from a German sort of Sammlung collection, but we try very strongly to always have this European perspective. And actively, we also collect very strongly now European artifacts and European contexts. And as you know, every museum in Europe, and especially museums in France and England and Germany and Austria and probably also Russia, are now tackling this 100 years of First World War. Whom of you have already seen the exhibition in the German Historical Museum? The historian, that's good. So there are a lot of exhibitions. And tonight, I would like to tell you a bit about the exhibition that we are currently showing, and it's on show for the whole year, till the summer 2015. And I now really proactively invite you to come. And I can give you a guided tour, and we can talk and reflect about the exhibition, and I hope you can be the ambassador and we can get into contact. So I hope that my speech will be less boring than the aura of museums, and that you think, yes, we're going to Dahlem, we're going to go to this Museum of European Cultures that now has, I think, a pretty innovative approach to exhibition telling in general, and especially depicting the First World War, because our approach is not historical per se, it's all about emotions. And showing emotions and having an emotive entrance to a narrative is pretty close to experience and experience storytelling. And there you come into an ethical dilemma that we were tackling when we were talking about this exhibition. So I would like to talk with you on a sort of meta perspective on how to make an exhibition, and also to tackle a bit of our conceptual ideas, and also to tackle something that we call museum ethics. Because I don't know if you have been to London to see the First World War trenches exhibition. I see someone nodding. Imperial War Museum in London, First World War trenches, which is very strongly focusing on experience and experiencing. And maybe there we felt you crossed an ethical line, because you don't, you sort of have a very evocative experience of going through the trenches and even smelling how the trenches might have smelled like. Can you do that? Is it good to attract an audience, also maybe a younger audience? But do you go beyond a certain point where you're not ethical anymore in your exhibition? So please go with me on this sort of helicopter view talking, and I didn't want to show you any pictures because I want you to come with me next week or the week after to Dahlem and come with me and show you around. Feeling war. And as you probably know, in the historical science we are now experiencing, or cultural science in general, the emotive turn. So an emotional, very personal entry into history, and we also seen that in my field, in the museum field as well. So we wanted to take people and take people into this emotional journey and to tackle the First World War from this more emotional experience. That was interesting because of this entry and experiencing, but respecting ethical boundaries, but also because of something else. Because emotions are not bound to a specific nation. They're not German, they're not French, they're not Polish, they're human. So a museum of European culture can tackle an historical perspective, of course, more thoroughly from a European perspective if you tackle it from this emotive perspective. And I think more and more museums, especially in the UK, are addressing issues as how to be relevant. How can you be a relevant platform for inclusion, for tackling issues in society, maybe taking an activist stand even. And we wanted to do that as well, which is difficult if you are under the umbrella of the national museums in Berlin, the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, which is A, very hierarchical, and B, they don't do politics, they say. But my colleagues would agree that museums always do politics. So doing politics, but sort of saying we're not doing politics was, we took the easy way out. We said, well, we do the emotive turn, and then we can address social issues without sort of immediately being spoken guilty of tackling emotions. When you enter the exhibition, which is actually quite innovative in that sense, we start with contemporary art. We start with Ucker, who is a very pacifistic post-World War II born artist, a German artist, and he deals always in his work with remembrance culture and pacifism. So here we immediately take a stand. We are framing the whole story of emotions of war through this pacifistic eye. And then, during the narrative, because in an exhibition you will always have a beginning and an end most of the time, we start the exhibition with the love for the country, patriotism, which you see not only in Germany already from the end of the 19th century, but also in other countries like England and in France and Austria, but especially in Germany because of its late nation building in the end of the 19th century. I don't have to tell you that. And then the love of this country, and you see a lot of Hindenburgs and military suits and toys for young boys, tackling and of course wanting to steer this love of the country and patriotism, and of course love of the Kaiser, is in a sort of communication, a sort of energy with this pacifistic work, contemporary work of art of Ucker. So you see this whole everyday navy suits, little children's toys, with the perspective of contemporary pacifism, which narrates a completely different story. And then we walk on through the exhibition, and then the love of the country becomes deep human love.
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me this evening. It's always a special privilege for me to be here in the ICD. I had the chance and was lucky to do several seminars and works together with Mark Donfried, with Donald over the last years, and I am always very much impressed by the audience, which is very international, very young, and I'm impressed by the philosophy, and had several discussions with Mark Donfried, especially about the idea of cultural diplomacy. And well, today we talk about war, and I'm not a specialist in cultural diplomacy, but as far as I understood, the idea of cultural diplomacy is actually a direct result of the experience of wars, the idea that there are being aware, understanding, creating cultural links between people from different parts of the world, from different regions, actually also from different culture, is maybe much easier and much more important than having this, what we also can call political diplomacy. So that's why it's a big privilege, and the whole evening has been a privilege to me because I learned a lot, like always, beginning with our friend from Poland. I didn't know that you were celebrating the 11th of November as natural. I didn't know that. And there was also an artwork from Martin Bayer, your artwork that you presented, Lusitania. And I was just sitting here like you and thinking about it. And we're talking about war, and then I was seeing this artwork, and from my point of view, it is a little bit our perception of war, because Emily, you mentioned my grandfather. That means when we, my generation, talk about war, or maybe I have to talk about the experience of my grandfather. Maybe you have to talk about the impression, the experience of your great-grandfather. So it's very far away, and that's why I was just thinking, I was watching this artwork and I was saying, oh, this is a perception of war, quite abstract. And on the other side, we saw in the beginning a very tough picture of Tommy Spray, the injured man of World War I, and this is another perception of war. And that's why actually I would just, maybe you can help me a little bit. Right now, in year 2014, we talk about World War I. This was 1914 to 1918. But right now there are several wars going on in the world. And maybe we can just mention this region, this country is a struggling war right now, to remember also the people being in war right now. Maybe you can just help me. Where are wars right now? In which countries? Yes. 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 South Sudan.
Mexico.
Yeah. Could you explain it? Because could you explain that?
Well, the war on drug trade.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. 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 So I think it is important to be aware that we talk about World War I think in the end to understand how important it is to fight war. And this is what we, I think, trying also this evening, to being aware of this threat of humans. And that's why I also like what Leontine said in the end, so this emotional part of war. And then maybe just two short stories about my grandfather. So I never met him. He's the father of my mother, who is German, and he was born in 1896. So he finished school in 1914 in March. High school had great results, really. That was actually the first thing I learned about him. I saw these results, I said, oh, this was an intelligent guy. And there was mentioned that, the school mentioned on this exam, he intends to study mathematics and natural science. But instead of going to university, he went to war, became a soldier. After that he studied. So that was actually the first personal experience for me with war. So I was just trying to imagine, you know, how he was 18 years old. So when I found this, maybe I was like 14 years old. That was like going to war in 4 years. So maybe you can also think about how will the 21st century be? Because maybe he was also like thinking, how will be the 20th century be? I finished school, I go to university, and then in the end he had to face 2 wars. And maybe we take time later in the panel discussion to talk about it. What will happen in the 21st century? We mentioned wars going on. We don't call them world wars, but okay. And the other thing I experienced this year in May, I was in Milan, and there was the Final Four of Basketball EuroLeague, and I had well, I was lucky to have a ticket for the Final Four, and that was a game, Maccabi Tel Aviv versus CSKA Moscow. And I was sitting, well, I think it was 10,000 crazy Maccabi fans from Tel Aviv. So it was a great experience, and next to me there was like a grandfather from Tel Aviv, and yes, there were 2 games, so we were just watching the game. They won, and finally they also won the EuroLeague. That was unbelievable. The final they won against Real Madrid. And we were just talking, and then, you know, he said, you know, you have to come to Israel. It's a safe place, you know. And he mentioned that his grandson was serving in the Israeli army. So, and preparing a little bit for this event tonight, actually, I sent him an email, just asking him, how's your grandson? So, and I haven't yet an answer. So, what I would like to say in the end this evening is, the personal experience is difficult for generations who haven't really experienced war, like our generations, my generation, your generation. But when we try, I mean, to open our eyes and just to see, you know, that, like you mentioned this war in Palestine right now, and you just sit next to somebody whose grandson actually maybe will die, we don't know, then it's a complete different perception from my point of view. And I would really be happy if we find a time to talk also about it when we talk about World War I. Thank you very much.